The Gorgias does not answer, obviously, every question that you might have. There are two questions in particular that are somewhat pressing. And we're going to turn to the Republic to try to see what Plato's answers to these questions might be. So the first, I'd mentioned earlier when we were talking about Callicles on philosophy. What does Plato think about philosophy, about the value of philosophy? Why does Plato think philosophy is worthwhile? Callicles obviously does not. Callicles is very critical of philosophy in the Gorgias, but the Gorgias, that dialogue itself, does not offer any direct rebuttal to Callicles's views on philosophy. So one of the things that we're going to do in turning to the Republic, this passage that we're reading from the Republic, is we're going to try to understand how Plato would respond to Callicles on philosophy, more generally, what Plato thinks of as the value of philosophy. So that's one outstanding question. And the other, and so the Gorgias just really doesn't touch that much at all. The other question, the Gorgias does kind of talk about, but it's more, it's a question of what a good life looks like. What exactly a good life will look like, how exactly we're supposed to live, and what makes a life good. Now, the Gorgias has a bit to say about this. When we looked at Socrates' ethical theory, we were talking about this. But we're going to turn to the Republic now to try to understand this more fully and to try to understand how philosophy fits in to the good life, right? The Gorgias doesn't give much of an indication at all of that, whereas the Republic does. And one way we can think about this is by focusing on a kind of curious comment that Socrates makes in the middle of the Gorgias. We didn't talk about this at the time, but when he's talking to Polus, Socrates says the following thing, right? So Polus and Socrates are arguing with each other. They disagree. Polus thinks tyrants are great. And he says, look, don't you think tyrants, or in this case, he's talking about the great king, who is the king of Persia. He's super wealthy, all this power, whatever. Wouldn't you say that that person was happy? They were living a good life to be this ultimately super powerful ruler. And Socrates says, well, I don't know. I don't know how that person stands with respect to education and justice. And Polus says, what? Right? He's amazed. How could you say this? Is happiness determined entirely by that? And Socrates says, yes, indeed. I think so. What I want to focus on first is happiness. They're talking about happiness here. And so what Socrates is essentially doing here is he's kind of laying out his hand as to what happiness consists in. Happiness, a good life, what we should be striving for, how you want to live your life. What do you want to get out of life? Happiness. And Socrates is saying it's determined by education and justice. Now, as I was just saying, the justice aspect of that, there are things that the Gorgias does with that, right? In Socrates' ethical theory. Socrates' ethical theory gives us some clue as to how justice might play into happiness, into the good life. But education, Gorgias doesn't say anything about education. The passage we're reading from the Republic is essentially about education. And at the beginning of Book 7 of the Republic, Plato makes this explicit. So the culmination of the passage that we're reading from the Republic is this allegory of the cave, and that allegory is explicitly said to be an allegory concerning education. And so we're going to turn to this passage from the Republic to try to understand how it is that education is related to happiness. That's the idea. Now, and then so how philosophy relates to that as well, because philosophy is going to be relevant to education for Plato. Now, in order to understand what's going on in this passage from the Republic, we need to understand a bit about Plato's kind of background theory. So Plato is assuming at this point in the Republic a certain kind of familiarity with his general metaphysical system, with his general view about the way the world is structured. And I'm not assuming you have that. And so what I'm going to do is kind of give that to you right now. Central to Plato's vision of how the universe, of how reality is structured, is this idea that there are two distinct worlds. There is what Plato will sometimes call the world of becoming, and there is the world of being. This is Plato's account of the fundamental structure of reality. Fundamentally, reality is composed of these two worlds. Okay, well, what are these? The world of becoming is the world that we have access to with our senses, sight, hearing, taste, etc., right? Anything that you have access to via your senses is part of the sensible world, is part of the world of becoming. In Plato's view, and this, I don't know, seems plausible enough, this world, the sensible world that you can touch and feel and hear and see and so on, is in space and in time. It's spatio-temporal, right? This is kind of obvious, right? The things you can touch are located out there in space and they're located in time. They change over time. This world of becoming, according to Plato, is always in flux. And what he means by that is that it's always changing. Everything in the sensible world is always changing. Now, you might think, that, well, yeah, that's kind of clear in the case of, I don't know, the sands in a desert, right? They're always being blown around and they're always changing. Or the clouds in the sky, they're always kind of moving. But I don't know, the desk in front of you or something like that seems fairly stable, doesn't seem to be changing. What Plato would want to say is that every sensible thing, including the desk in front of you, is undergoing change. The difference between your desk, say, and then the sand being whipped around by the wind in the desert is that your desk is changing very slowly. But if we left your desk right where it was for, millions of years or whatever, when we came back to it, it would be a pile of rubble. It would have disintegrated. It would have eroded or something, right? Things are always changing. Your body is always changing. You might think, no, my body's always the same. I'm always the same. No, it's not true. Cells are kind of constantly flaking off, right? Your skin cells, whatever, flake off. Your cells die, they're repaired, they're replaced. Your body is always changing. Everything in the sensible world is always changing. Furthermore, everything in the sensible world is in some way other than what it is. And this follows from the idea that things are always changing. So your desk, right? We just talked about how that's actually changing, even though it seems to be fairly stable. Well, it's in some way other than what it is. Why? Because it's slowly becoming a non-desk. It's slowly becoming a pile of rubble or whatever, right? This idea is more clear, or Plato tends to make to illustrate this idea that everything in the sensible world is in some way other than what it is, by talking about adjectives, predicates that we might apply to things. And so one of Plato's favorite examples here is beauty. there are beautiful things in the sensible world, right? A sunset, a person, a painting, whatever. And what Plato would want to say is that if it's a sensible thing, right, such as a sunset, a painting, a person, whatever, it may be beautiful, but in some ways, it's not beautiful. In some ways, it's probably ugly. It's not perfectly beautiful. Yeah. That's kind of the idea. From a certain angle, from a certain perspective, or in a certain way, it's not, in fact, beautiful. That's going to be what Plato thinks. Everything in the sensible world is like that, right? Maybe a clearer example. So Plato often uses beauty as an example. Perhaps a clear example could be something like a triangle. Uh, you draw a triangle on the board, it's a triangle on the board. But in some ways, it's not a triangle because the lines aren't perfectly straight. And the angles aren't going to add up exactly to 180 degrees and so on. And so that triangle, that sensible triangle, is in some ways not a triangle. Yeah, that's Plato's point. And because everything in the world is in flux, everything in the world of becoming is in flux, Plato's idea is that nothing in the world of becoming, nothing in the sensible world, strictly speaking, is. Why? Because everything's always becoming something else. Your desk, strictly speaking, is not. It doesn't exist fully. Why? Because it's becoming something else. It's not stable. That's kind of the idea that Plato has. And so it isn't, strictly speaking, a desk. Why? Well, because it's becoming a pile of rubble. That's the idea that Plato has. This idea, I think, is a little bit odd. It can take a little bit to wrap your mind around, I suppose. But in Plato, and this is already clear from the way this is being set out, I think, Plato contrasts becoming with being. If something is becoming something else, it, in some sense, is not what it is. It, strictly speaking, is not, because it's becoming the other thing. It lacks stability. It's not fully what it is because it's becoming something else. And because in some way it's other than what it is, right? The beautiful painting is in some way ugly, right? It's got an ugly color in it. And so in some way it's not really beautiful. Now, because of these aspects of the sensible world, it's always in flux. It's everything in it is in some way other than what it is. We can't have knowledge about things in this world, according to Plato. You can't really know the things in the sensible world because they lack the kind of stability that's necessary to have knowledge of something. Now, this point seems very counterintuitive. Well, don't we do science? And don't scientists know about things in this world? And so, what is Plato talking about? We're going to return to this idea in a second. We'll be able to make sense of this idea better if we look at the world of being now. So let's turn to that, and then we'll return to this stuff about knowledge and the world of becoming and so on. So the world of being, what we're going to find, it's really in many ways the opposite of the world of becoming. So the world of being is not the sensible world. It's what Plato calls the intelligible world, the world that we perceive with our minds, not with our senses. And so to give us a very kind of quick example of the kind of thing you have in mind, he has in mind. When you think think about 2 + 2 = 4. You're not doing that with your sense of touch. You're not doing that with your eyes. You're not doing that with your nose. You're doing that with your mind. right? And so you're accessing the intelligible world when you think about these truths of mathematics, right? The truths of mathematics are not really about the sensible world, and you don't really gain access to them using your senses. Maybe you use certain sensible things as props to help you figure things out, but when you're, just do the 2 + 2 = 4. You don't need to have two things in front of you and then another two things and then count or whatever, right? It's not a sensible operation. It's an intelligible one. You perceive it with your mind. The world of being, the intelligible world, is not spatiotemporal. The number two is not located in space, and it's not in time, right? It's not anywhere. 2 + 2 = 4, that truth. It's not around the corner. You wouldn't go find it at the store or whatever. It's just not in the spatiotemporal world. Rather, it's in this intelligible world, right? And again, to think about this, just think of it in these terms, right? The number two, where would you go find it? At what time did it exist? I mean, that's a little bit, it's always existed. It will always exist. It doesn't really exist in time. And it's not around the corner. You don't go find it somewhere. You can find things that kind of instantiate that property, which we'll talk about in just a second. But the number two itself, you don't find anywhere, or 2 + 2 = 4, right? It's not in the garage, right? You access it with your mind. It's not in space and time. Moreover, it's always the same. The objects in this world of being are always the same. They don't change, right? So again, in contrast to the world of becoming, 2 + 2 = 4 has always been true. It's always been exactly like that. 2 + 2 has always equaled 4. It equals 4 now. It'll equal 4 in a million years. It's always exactly the same. It does not change. And more generally, the truths of mathematics, right? Always the same. We might discover them. That kind of thing happens all the time, right? We discover new mathematical truths, but that's really just discovering something that is already there. It's not any change. It's just we figured something out. It's always been there, and then we figure it out. So these intelligible objects are always the same. Everything in this intelligible world is in no way other than what it is. So, in contrast to the world of becoming. So, take two, for example. Let's say you had two apples in front of you. Those two apples are in some way not two because they're not identical. They might be apples, but they're not really identical apples, right? The one is a little bit bigger than the other has a bite taken out of it, whatever, right? And so they're not strictly speaking two. Because to have two, you'd have to have two identical things, something like that. When you think about the number two, however, that is perfectly two. Yeah. It's in no way other than two. Or think about a triangle again. When we were talking about the triangle that you draw on the board, that's part of the world of becoming. In some ways, it's not a triangle. Its lines aren't perfectly straight. The angles don't add up to 180 degrees. But when you think about the triangle with your mind, when you access the triangularity using your mind, what you're thinking about is perfectly triangular. It's perfectly a triangle. The lines are perfectly straight. The angles add up perfectly to 180 degrees. It is perfectly a triangle. It's in no way other than a triangle. The world of being is populated by things that are, because these things are not changing. They completely are what they are, right? The contrast to the world of becoming. They are stable, yeah. And so the things in the world of being, those are the proper objects of knowledge. And this seems kind of obvious in the case of mathematics, right? So, what you know about when you know mathematics, Plato would say, are beings. You know about triangularity, right? And mathematicians can describe that for you and they know all about it. And what they know are these intelligible realities. Turn to science, then, right? This puzzle that we had. Seems like we can know about certain things. Seems like scientists know things. And so what's going on? Is Plato just wrong? Does he have this backwards view? He thinks we just can't know the sensible world? No, I think what Plato would draw our attention to is the fact that, well, what scientists, what physicists say really know are not particular things in the sensible world. They know the law like regularities that govern these things in the sensible world. And so, a physicist, knows about the law of gravity or general relativity or whatever, right? Quantum field theory. They know about these general systematic laws. Those laws are the proper objects of knowledge. Those laws are not spatiotemporal. Those laws are always the same. Those laws are in no way other than what they are, and so on, right? And they're accessed using our minds. Now, we might use sensible things like experiments and so on to figure out what those laws are, but those laws themselves are in the world of being. And so that's what physicists really know. Things like these laws, right? The law of gravity. The law of gravity is not in your garage. It's not hidden under your bed or whatever. It's not in space and time. Gravity might be, but the law of gravity is not. The thing that the physicist really knows is a being in Plato's sense. Or at least that's how Plato is thinking about this, right? So we have these two worlds, the world of becoming and the world of being. Last thing that I want to mention with regard to kind of the metaphysical background, the structure of reality that Plato is working with here, is what is called the theory of the forms. So Plato tells us what the objects in the intelligible world are. I've just been saying things like laws or the number two or whatever. What Plato would say is that the objects in the intelligible world are forms. His word for those objects, forms. And Plato is perhaps most famous for his theory of the forms. So forms are intelligible objects. They are in no way other than what they are, right? These forms. And what we're going to see in the Republic is he talks about these forms all the time. Okay, so what's the idea? The general motivation that Plato has, why, what's he thinking about with these forms? Plato gives in various places what's called a one over many argument. So Plato would say something like, look, in this world, we see many things that have some property, shared property. So let's use beauty. This is one of Plato's favorite examples. We see many beautiful things, or we see many triangles, or we see many things that are two, right? You could, whatever. Let's do beauty, but you can do those other examples too. So we see many beautiful things, a sunset, a painting, a person. Okay, fine. Well, Plato's idea here is that there has to be some one thing in virtue of which we call these very different things, right? A sunset is like clouds and light. A painting is pigments and oil and canvas, and a person is flesh and blood and whatever, right? They're very, very different things. There must be some thing in virtue of which we call these very different things beautiful. For why else do we call them the same name? But what on earth could that be? I mean, a person is made out of flesh and blood. A sunset is made out of, photons and whatever. What on earth could be in common between these things such that we call them by the same name? Here's Plato's answer. the form of beauty. There is an intelligible object, beauty, the form of beauty. In the same way that we call all triangles on a board triangles, we can call all beautiful things beautiful because they share the form, right? So there's a form of triangle. And the triangles that you draw on a board stand in some sort of relationship to the form of triangularity. They share that. And it's that form of triangle. It's because they all participate in that form of triangle that all the triangles you draw on the board are, in fact, triangles, right? They share that in common. A sunset, a painting, a person share this form of beauty in common. Further characteristics of forms. These will help explain this idea, this one over many argument. So forms are, right? They're the objects in the intelligible world. So everything that we said about the intelligible world can be said about forms. Sensible things participate in forms. This is really the crucial point. The triangle you draw on the board, Plato would say, participates in the form of triangle. The beautiful sunset participates in the form of beauty. And it's because these sensible things participate in these forms that these sensible things are what they are. Forms cause the things that participate in them to be what they are. So the form of triangle causes the triangle that you draw on the board to be a triangle. That's what causes it to be a triangle. The form of beauty causes the beautiful sunset to be beautiful. It's because the sunset participates in the form of beauty that the sunset is beautiful. And if the sunset ceased to participate in the form of beauty, it would cease to be beautiful. I am a human being because I participate in the form of human being. And when I cease to participate in that form, I will cease to be a human being. Your car is red because it participates in the form of car. Your hair is blonde because it participates in the form of blonde, and so on, right? Any kind of characteristic like this, Plato seems to want to say, anything is what it is because of the forms that it participates in. And so there's this relationship between the intelligible world and the sensible world. And the main way that Plato talks about that relationship is participation. So the things here in the sensible world are what they are in virtue of their participating in the forms. And lastly, right, and this just follows from the fact that these forms are objects in the intelligible world. Forms are the objects of knowledge. And so one way to think about this, again, turn to science. There are people who study plants, right? And what Plato would want to say is they don't really have knowledge of that particular fern that they're looking at using a magnifying glass or what. I don't know what botanists do. I don't think they go around with magnifying glass, but whatever. They don't have knowledge of that particular sensible fern, rather, or tree. Let me just use tree, say, because I'm going to use tree in later lectures. Rather, they have knowledge of the form of tree, right? The biologist, the botanist who knows all about trees, say, they don't really know about that specific tree outside their window because that's always changing. It's not stable. It's part of the sensible world and so on. They know about the essence of treeness. They know about the form of tree, that about tree nature and the essence of tree, The form of tree is always what it is. It's one of these intelligible objects, right? And so that's what scientists come to know in Plato's view. They come to know, they come to understand the forms that are relevant to their field of inquiry. They don't know about that particular tree. Rather, they know about tree nature. And tree nature, Plato would say, well, that's the form of tree. With this background, now we're going to turn to the three images that Plato gives us in the Republic: the image of the sun, the divided line, and then the image of the cave, the allegory of the cave.